Got to turn my microphone on. Good morning. I'm Neil, one of the pastors here, and it's good to be back with you. It feels like a long time since I've preached. I mean, last week, the family and I, we weren't here, but we really enjoyed getting to sit together and hear Ben's message. We watched worship. If I'm being totally honest, we didn't sing, but we watched worship and we're so encouraged by the word taught. The week before, obviously, was our indoor baptism service, and how many of you were encouraged by the testimonies of God's work in the lives of our church family? That was a pretty amazing week. And so here we are. It's been kind of 3 weeks in that sense, since I've been preparing and in the Word with you, so it's so good. It's so good to be back with you this morning. And as we dive into our passage, I want to invite you to turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 12. We're picking up the last part of Jesus' interaction with the scribes before he leaves the temple, ultimately is arrested, crucified, and rises again. It's on page 849 if you're using the chairback Bibles. And as you're turning there, I wanted to talk a little bit about a television show that, if I'm being honest, I've never actually watched. I saw a Saturday Night Live version of it with Kylo Ren pretending to be an undercover boss on one of their Death Stars, but the show Undercover Boss, I don't know how many of you have watched that before, but the premise is essentially this. An owner of a company will dress up like an unknown employee so he can go in and see what things are really like. By hiding their appearance, they can discover what their employees are really like. And so here's the funny thing to me. By deceiving the employees, I think the hope of the show is that they'll catch the employees deceiving the boss. And here's why this works. All of us, we're naturally thrown off by appearance. It's the way we're designed. We judge with our eyes, but our judgments with our eyes are far from infallible. But here's the good news. God is not deceived or thrown off by appearances. He is more concerned, and he's able to see what's really going on in our hearts. And this morning, we really look at two examples. And in those two examples, we're given this reality, that what we treasure in our hearts will determine what we do with the treasures in our lives. But conversely, what we do with the treasures in our lives will demonstrate the things that we treasure in our hearts. And one of the examples we're given is a bad example. One is a good example. And in some ways, because we're familiar with the Bible, I think we lose the shock or surprise of what Jesus is telling us. He begins in verse 38 of chapter 12 with the negative example. And he says in verse 38, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces. They have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feast, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which made a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." You see, he begins with the bad example. Of all people in their culture, he's talking about the scribes, those who treasured their own significance. Look out. Beware of the scribes. Now, he's talking here in general. Now, as we saw last week in Ben's message, there were scribes who were more humble in their study of the word. Last week, we saw one who engaged seriously with Jesus. But Jesus is talking in general of the attitude, of the posture of the scribes, the Pharisees, the Herodians, those who have been opposing Jesus' ministry. But also those who would have served as examples, those who would have been the people that their culture looked up to. If you had asked in their time who were the religious, who were the holy ones, it was people like them that people would have pointed to. And he points out a number of things about the scribes. He says the ones who wish to walk around in long robes, decorative gatherings. Now, it's possibly what they were wearing designated their education, their position in society. It's possible that their clothing just demonstrated or communicated wealth. But in Matthew 23, which I think is an extended version of what Jesus says here, he points out two particular aspects of the clothing of the religious leaders: their broad phylacteries and their long fringes. Phylacteries were literally a box that contained the scriptures that they would wear on their foreheads or on their arm near their hearts. Their fringes were long strings of cloth, and these were symbols or reminders of their religious devotion. And so the bigger they were, the more holiness that these communicated. So most likely what they were wearing was meant to draw attention to their goodness. But not only did they wish to walk around in long robes, they wished to be recognized when they were out in public, when they walked through the marketplace. They enjoyed being greeted. Now, not all of us can identify with this. I mean, I don't know how many of you are like me, but there's times when we go into Walmart and we want to see others, and there's times where we don't. And seeing others doesn't necessarily coincide with our wishes. But in their case, they want the attention. They want the warm greeting. They want the honored titles. But not only do they wish to be recognized by their clothing, they wish to be recognized in public, but when it comes to the religious gatherings in the synagogues, they hope to have the seat of honors. When it comes to banquets or parties being thrown in people's homes, they hope that they're given the best seats, the best place actually to recline, which is how they would have sat at a party. Now in Luke 14, Jesus tells a parable and he says, look, when you go to a party, don't take the seat of honor. Because then if somebody more important shows up, they're going to come up to you and ask you to leave. Instead, choose the seat of dishonor so that you might be noticed and taken to the position of honor. So where you sat when it came to the parties in those days meant something. But not only that, in their culture, it was an honor to have certain people at your gatherings. So if you remember, at various times in Jesus' ministry, the religious leaders would come to them and say, how dare you eat with those people? How dare you join them at their parties? But for those people, the tax collectors and the sinners, it was an honor that a rabbi would join them and partake in their party. These religious leaders sought the attention of not only being invited, but being given the seat of honor in their gatherings in their community. Not only did they have these wishes, but Jesus also calls out what's going on. Look again in verse 40. They devour widows' houses, and for a pretense, they make long prayers. They pray powerfully, they pray beautifully, but their desire is not to talk or communicate with God. It's the recognition of the people around them. But what does it mean that they were devouring widows' homes? Now, possibly, what Jesus is talking about is the fees that these religious leaders would have been charging. So how they made their money, the scribes in their days, was essentially they were compensated by subsidies. Those subsidies may have come from the temple treasuries, what Jesus is going to be observing in the next few verses. But also they could have been subsidized by the hospitality of those they taught. There's at least a chance that what Jesus is saying is you're going into people's homes and quite literally you're eating them out of house and home, which is the saying that we have. And possibly those they're taking advantage of, the hospitality for, could very well have been the widows in the religious communities. But behind these observations Jesus makes, understand what we're seeing. The warning that Jesus is giving is rooted in the longing of the hearts of these scribes that he describes. The main verb, it's not really a main verb, it's kind of an adjectival verb, but the verb there is they long for. What is it they wish for? The fancy dress, the greetings, the places of prominence in the synagogue and in the marketplace. And what is that desire? Ultimately, the desire is the recognition of men. They want to be seen and noticed by others. Now, as we've already said, not every scribe was like this. This wasn't true across the board. In some ways, Jesus could have said today, be careful of pastors. Pastors who desire to be fancily dressed, pastors who desire to be recognized, to be given places of prominence, who take advantage of the poor in their generosity. And for a pretense, try to impress you with their prayers. You know, there's a pastor that I knew who told the story of the first time they ever preached a sermon. It went really well, and people were telling him after the sermon how great it was, and he found himself actually traveling around the church building in order to find people who hadn't yet been able to comment, so they too could tell him how good his sermon was. Now, Tim was here at the practice preach on Sunday, and he said he wanted to make sure I said this wasn't him. But they were seeking the approval of men by what they wore, by the greetings they longed to receive. But not only were they seeking the recognition of men, they were seeking personal comfort at the expense of those who had need. They were taking advantage in some way of the very people they were called to care for. Even the way they prayed was a form of manipulation or self-centeredness. And how different is this type of leadership than the leadership that we see again and again in the life of Jesus? These religious leaders, they're leading for themselves, whereas Jesus has come to lay down his life for the sheep. And a question that this example begs us to ask is, who is it that we are performing for? Or let me ask it in a slightly different way. Where are the eyes of your heart set? Now, when you find yourself with this thought, what are they going to think? Who is the they that you think of? I can remember when I was young and we fought with my dad tooth and nail because he always wanted us to wear gym shoes from Kmart. And we were worried about what they would say. The they was our friends, because who else would notice what our shoes looked like? Who is it that you find yourself misrepresenting the truth when you talk to them? Or maybe not sharing with them the whole truth? Friends, how is it that we see fear of man or a desire to gain the recognition or approval of men in our own lives? Because here's the warning Jesus gives us at the end of verse 40. They will receive greater judgment or condemnation. Why? Because these leaders of the people of Israel are misleading the flock. Now, we haven't covered it yet. We'll come back to it after Easter. But in Mark 9:42, Jesus says that anyone who would mislead one of the little ones, it would be better if a millstone was tied around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. Jesus takes seriously the leading of his people. But not only are they ultimately misleading the flock, they're misrepresenting Jesus, the chief shepherd, who they were called to lead like and lead for. Their judgment is greater because they're living their life for temporal or earthly gain. Now in Mark 6:2, there's this warning given to those who practice their righteousness to be seen by men. And he says in verse 6:2, or I said Matthew 6:2, he gives this warning. But he says in verse 2 of chapter 6 in Matthew, they've received their reward in full. You see, their temporal well-being, the recognition that they were receiving in the community, was not able to save them from eternal destruction. I believe that's the real warning of this passage. Be careful not to put earthly treasure over eternal gains. Now, the scribes who Jesus describes here, they're proving the point that we started with in the beginning. And again, these guys, they knew their Bible. People would have looked to them to have an understanding of the law. They were the ones, the scribes in particular, who guarded the tradition. It's why they were so offended by Jesus. These are the people in their community who would have been admired for their commitment to the Lord, but it wasn't ultimately the Lord that they treasured. You see, what we treasure in our hearts will determine what we do with the treasures in our lives, and what we do with the treasures in our lives will demonstrate what we treasure in our hearts. That's the bad example. It's who we would have least expected. But then he turns and he goes to the treasury. Now the treasury, verse 41, was just inside the court of widows. And I think we have that picture of the temple again. I was going to kind of point out where it was. We can't quite see, but it would have been right inside this area in a place called the court of women. This was the farthest in that a Jewish woman could go into the temple area. And right inside that area, there were these 13 receptacles. And they said they were trumpet-shaped, which essentially meant they were wider at the top and got narrow as they went down. But these 13 receptacles were there so that people could bring their temple tax or free will offering and place it in as they came inside the temple. Now, the taxes Jesus is witnessing being given, this isn't the money that would have been given to the poor, but this was money that was being given for the temple, and also it could be seen as an act of atonement for the person who gave it. It was used to upkeep the function of the temple. As we've already said, it may even be there to subsidize the scribes who were serving there. And he sits down across from it, and he starts to observe the money that people are giving. Now, I want to point something out as kind of an aside, something that we see in this pattern of worship. Now, this is the pattern of worship that's prescribed in the Old Testament. And what you need to notice is giving is a regular part of how they gather to worship. Now, I don't want to draw a straight line in this case. And what I mean by that is it's not, well, they gave, so you must give. But I want us to observe for just a moment what they did. And it's reasonable to consider that we ought do the same. But what I find interesting about this particular giving is it reminds us that it's not unspiritual to give to the needs of the meeting space, the elements that we need for worship. i.e., buildings are not a bad thing. And what God entrusts to us for the sake of our gathering is something that we should care for. Now, if you're here this morning and our church is the regular place that you gather, then I believe the biblical example that we see is that you should give to the church that you regularly gather with and support the gathering of the ministry. Now, if you're here this morning and you're a guest, my encouragement is not that you need to give here, but my encouragement is where you gather, the church that you gather with on a regular basis, you ought to give to support the work of ministry there. Now, in our setting, we don't normally take an offering. We have offering boxes in the back, but we do believe that giving is an important aspect of worship. And as Jesus watches this, I think there's at least an affirmation of that. But if we're going to ask this question or talk about this, here's what we could ask. What should we give then? Now, some would argue that today we still should honor the call to give a tithe, which is a fancy way of saying the first 10%. Now, you see tithes called for at certain places in the Old Testament, Leviticus 24, Numbers 18, Deuteronomy 14. And some say that expectation Jesus doesn't challenge, and so it continues. Now, there's others who would say that we're free to give as the Lord leads. Now, a few years back, I read a book by Randy Alcorn. Randy Alcorn wrote a small book that probably many of you have read or at least heard of called The Treasure Principle. But he also wrote kind of a larger book on the same subject called Money, Possessions, and Eternity. Now, and what he argued in that book is that biblically speaking, the tithe was the beginning of giving, not the total. In fact, it wasn't just 10% that they gave, but the 10% was kind of the base, and then their giving and their generosity was called to beyond that. He said this in his book. He said, tithing isn't the ceiling of giving. It's the floor. It's not the finish line of giving. It's the starting blocks. Tithes can launch us into the mindset, skills, and habits of grace giving. So rather than being able to answer this morning for you, what should we give, I want to consider a different question, and I believe it's the foundation of this passage. What should be the foundation for our giving? Notice again the example of the poor widow. As all these wealthy people are coming in and they're giving large sums, verse 42, this poor widow comes in and puts in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. Now, isn't it interesting that they had pennies back then? They didn't have pennies back then. But the amount she gave was the equivalent of 1/64th of a laborer's daily wage. So we're talking the person that went out and worked in the field, earned a day's wages. It was only 1/64th of that. I was honestly shocked that it was worth their time to make coins that small. But she puts them in one again, these trumpet-shaped receptacles. And part of what you see is that as all this is being noticed, the giving was clear to everyone. One of the commentators that I was reading about this speculated that they may have even announced their gifts as they were giving it. But even if they weren't announcing it, their gifts would be cleared by the type of coin they gave, the numbers of coins they gave. So if it was a big gold coin, you'd see it. If it was a big silver coin, you'd see it. These 2 coins, you may have been like, did we miss it? What was that? But the fact that Jesus is sitting there and watching all this at least proves that there's some element of spectacle to giving to the treasury. There's some part of this that is meant to be noticed. Now again, at the practice preach, it was at least proposed that we try something like this. I don't think we'll take that seriously. That was a joke. And what I find interesting about this is the wealthy, as they're giving these great sums, they may have been giving a tithe. But honestly, they may have been giving more than a tithe. And the danger of tithing is that we can give God his, but the assumption is the rest belongs to us. The 10% we give to the Lord becomes a means of obligation. God, we give this, so you must do for us. Or he may say, you've already got your piece, the rest belongs to me. Another danger of giving can be that 10%, that tithe, becomes another means of societal approval. Now, maybe in our day and age, there's not a box that we put things in that everyone notices, but there could be ways we make known what we give. And our giving can be another means of looking for the approval of men. Now, in the last few weeks, we had some discussions in our small groups on stewardship. And in 2 different groups, this quote or something like it came up. The question is not how much of my money do I give to God, but instead how much of God's money do I keep for me? Now, Jesus' thoughts as he's watching all this, he doesn't seem to critique giving based purely on the amount, but by how the amount demonstrates the conditions of the giver's heart. And the goal here isn't to lambaste the wealthy. That's not what he's doing. Wealth is not a bad thing, but he's reorienting our understanding of generosity. This widow, this poor woman, someone who would have gone unnoticed in these gatherings, is giving more than all the other contributors. You see, the wealthy, they gave from abundance. Now, in the Message translation of this passage, it says they won't even miss it. But she gave out of her poverty all that she had. That last little section in verse 44 where the ESV translate all she had to live on, literal Greek is all of her life, the whole of her life. The widow was commended for her radical generosity because her generosity ultimately communicated she treasured something more than her life or her well-being. Contrast that with the scribes. Everything they did was self-seeking. They prayed to be noticed. They dressed to be noticed. They attended the gatherings to be noticed. Their efforts were self-seeking. Her generosity was self-risking. She was being generous with what she needed to live because there was something more important to her than her life. Friends, a principle we see in this is that we will always sacrifice what we treasure less to gain what we treasure most. Or another way I could say it is we will hold most dearly to our greatest treasures. Now, a few years back, I was walking with a friend through a pretty intense wrestle with addiction. And I'd gotten wind that they had left home. They were staying in a hotel room. And as I was on the way there, I talked with another person who had walked through addiction in their own life. And they gave me this great advice. They said, Neil, you could try and make them do what you want them to do, but if they're not ready to do it, it's not going to work. And so I walked into the hotel room where this gentleman was staying, and there was a little bit of a bottle of alcohol left. And I said to him, I'd love to help you get rid of it, but I think you need to give that up. And he did something that blew my mind. He took the bottle of alcohol and he got back into the bed, and then he covered the alcohol with the blanket so I couldn't see it, as if I would have forgotten it was there. And you know what struck me about that moment? This was like me with my sin. This is the way that I clutch things and draw them near and try and hide them with a blanket, as if the one who matters won't know. Friends, we will cling dearly and tightly to whatever it is we treasure most, even if we would look at it and say, how foolish are we being? But why is this account here? You know, in chapter 12, we've been walking through these confrontations between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Herodians. He's being questioned by the scribes. And now we have this picture of a woman, this widow who we don't even know her name, but she's given everything that she has. I think that why this is here in Mark's narrative is to contrast with the scribes in general. They are the ones that we think of as religious, but their hearts were not set on the Lord. They were the ones who in their greed they preyed on, the ones who truly were generous. I mean, how many of us, if we were in this situation, we were watching people give their gifts, how many of us would have totally overlooked her and her gift? Maybe we would have noticed it, and we could have scoffed at the small amount, or we could have said, man, I don't know that she'd be given that. How's she going to eat this week? Or mentally, we may have just passed over what she did, anxious to see the next big drop of coins. But Jesus calls our attention to her. The one being devoured deserves the commendation. But I believe another reason that this story is here is because her example fits the pattern that we've already seen taking place in Mark. If you've been with us for a while, you remember back in Mark 8, when Peter announces that Jesus is the Christ, he then says, whoever wants to follow me must take up their cross and follow me. Because if you want to save your life, you have to lose your life. But if you try and hold on to your life, then you'll lose it. Now again, we haven't gotten there yet, but when we go back to Mark 10, we're going to see that famous story of Jesus and the rich young ruler, who he looks at and he loves him, and he says, one thing you lack, go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then come follow me. Can we be honest about this example we're seeing in the widows? This calling is much harder for most of us in this room. Because let's be honest, our giving, our generosity doesn't call into question our ability to eat this coming week. Our giving doesn't call into question our ability to pay our mortgage, our ability to put clothes on our back or shoes on our feet. For most of us, it's challenging to relate to this type of generosity, this level of trust. It's hard for us to relate to the faith that she demonstrates. You see, the more that we have, the more we're tempted to hold tightly to what we have. I mean, how many of you can remember back to your early days of adulthood, those of you who have reached that point? You know, you'd look at your checking account and be like, hey, we have $150. We're going to Applebee's. Now, how many of us at a later point in life, what we're nervous about is what this next big thing will do to our extra, our reserve. This widow demonstrates incredibly costly faith. Because all that she has, Jesus says, she puts into the receptacle. Here's the truth that Jesus is telling us, and it's true about who he is. You see, he loves us enough to call us into freedom from the idols of the treasures that grip our hearts. That's how he loves us. Because what we treasure in our hearts will determine what we do with the treasures in our lives, and what we do with the treasures in our lives will determine what we treasure in our hearts. The right heart for giving is a heart that treasures Jesus above everything. But how are we tempted to water down this teaching? Now, I want to make this clear. Jesus is not anti-rich or anti-wealth. That's not what we're saying. But we have to be aware of the dangers of our own hearts. Here's the truth of the biblical account. Hard work is a good thing. Being wise with resources and money is a good thing. But pride, self-reliance, possessiveness, those can become dangerously bad. You know, back in Daniel's account of living in exile, he tells the story of when Nebuchadnezzar is walking on the roof of his palace. And he looks out and he says, is this not Babylon that I have built with my own might for my own glory? And God strikes Nebuchadnezzar down and humbles him by making him like an animal. Now, none of us have built Babylon. Most of us don't live in a palace. But how many of us can understand the temptation to look at what God has blessed us with and say, look at what I've built for my own glory? Now contrast that with an attitude that says, how has God called me to steward what he has entrusted to me for his glory? Friends, here's a question I want you to consider. I want me to consider this week. Does the Jesus we serve merely affirm our comfort? Does he merely affirm the things that we want to be about? Now, I can't answer that for all of us sitting in a room like this. But this is a conversation worth having with a friend that you trust in the coming weeks. This is a prayerful conversation worth having if you happen to be married with your spouse. Friends, have you thought through? Have you counted the cost of the things you have acquired? And have you considered the question, have your acquisitions ultimately acquired you? Friends, I would ask you to prayerfully consider what earthly treasures might be worth letting go of in order to cling to a treasure we will never lose. Let me share with you examples I've heard of that going on in our own church family. There's two people I know of, I'm not going to say their names, but two people in our church family who had jobs that were paying very well, who provided various opportunities because of the wealth, who recognized that they weren't living with kingdom value. And in both those circumstances, those people left those jobs in order to take jobs that would free them up to serve the Lord, or that fit more into the way that God had shaped their hearts. They were willing to let go of the wealth they could acquire with their own hard work in order to do something that they felt like was more honoring to Jesus. Now, as you're listening to this, you might be saying, Neil, what you're saying is our affection for Jesus may cost us everything. The answer to that is yes. It may. But I promise you, if we could see things as they truly are, we would pay that price gladly. We would pay it gladly. Let me give you two examples, one from my own life. And I think I've told this story before, but when I moved up here, Dr. Jeff Hallett sat me down, a guy who helped me get into hunting, and he said, Neil, be careful. Make sure that you don't stand before Jesus someday and say, Jesus, you won't imagine the deer head I got. Another story that John Piper tells in his book, Don't Waste Your Life, is he gives this warning to retirees who want to retire and go buy a house on the beach and collect seashells. He says, you really want to stand before Jesus someday and say, look at my shell collection. Friends, I would have you consider this question. The scribes walked around in nice clothing. They had the esteem of the people in their community. But when they stood before the Lord, what they would hear is, you've already gotten your reward. Whereas this widow, who we would have been tempted to overlook, whose gift we would have ignored, she heard from the Savior, even in her own lifetime, well done. Another thing that I would ask you to consider as you wrestle with some of these questions is, what do you look back on? And with the benefit of hindsight, you say to yourself, based on what it cost, I probably shouldn't have done that. Now, what we're talking about here, this passage, it isn't necessarily to teach us about giving, but I do believe this passage is saying our giving is a teaching on our hearts. Because what we treasure in our hearts will determine what we do with the treasures in our lives. And what we do with the treasures in our lives demonstrates the things we treasure in our hearts. Friends, what would you do for Jesus if you were not afraid of the cost? What is it that right now in your life, if you were being totally honest, you find yourself clinging to, afraid to let go of? Now just imagine with me for 1 minute, what would our town look like? What would our communities around this town look like if the 350-ish or so people who gather in our church week in, week out would live radically for Jesus like this widow? Who would say, we're willing to let go of everything for his sake. Friends, the warning of this passage isn't money bad. It's the affirmation of a judgment of a holy God. You see, the scribes looked good, but they were doomed. The widow looked ragged, but she was affirmed. And I close with this question, and I've said it before, but every one of you here this morning, you're living for something. You're living for something. And the question you have to consider is, will what you're living for save you in the end? Two examples. The scribes who gained the affection and attention of men, and the widow who gave all she had because she trusted her life to the Lord. Will what you are living for save you in the end? Let's close in prayer. Jesus, we thank you for this warning that you've given us at the conclusion of this section where you've been challenging and been challenged by the religious leaders of your day. Lord, if we're being honest, every one of us, myself very much included, it's much more comfortable to think and live like the scribe. It's easier to want to be approved of by the people around us, to live comfortably, not thinking about the cost. But Jesus, you call us to consider the example of the widow. Lord, humble us this morning. Lord, help us to see the things in our lives that we are treasuring, that we're trying to cling to, the things that if we never let go of in order to hold on to you, we will regret in the end. Lord, help us to see it and give us the strength to let go. But Lord, not only that, I know that ultimately our generosity is not rooted in earning favor, is not rooted in trying to secure for us an eternity. It's rooted in our understanding of what you've done for us. Jesus, it says in 2 Corinthians 8 that you were rich, but you became poor for our sake, that we might be rich in you. Lord, we are blessed. We are blessed not only in this life, but we are blessed forever because we are yours. So Lord, help us to live out of the blessing of being your dear and precious children. Help us to live out of the security of having an inheritance that cannot be lost, cannot be stolen, will not fade away. Lord, help us to live fully for you. Jesus, make us wise. Make us wise in stewarding whatever it is you've entrusted to us. But Lord, set the affection of our heart, the focus of the eyes of our hearts on you, on your goodness, on your affection, and on your glory. That everything we have and everything we do would be bent towards bringing more glory to you. We pray this all, Jesus, in your precious and holy name. Amen.